Planned Parenthood funding, pro-life reaction to the largest abortion provider pulling out of the federal family planning program. Government shakeup. The Prime Minister of Italy says he's resigning, what it could mean for the country and the entire Eurozone. Funding freeze. How a change in assistance programs could impact groups like Catholic Relief Services. And rebuilding Notre Dame. An update on the restoration efforts of the famed Catholic cathedral. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 20th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Pro-life groups are reacting today after Planned Parenthood left the federal family planning program, Title X. The organization made the decision to avoid abiding by a Trump administration rule prohibiting clinics from referring women for abortions. White House correspondent Mark Irons breaks down what the loss of federal funds means for the nation's largest abortion provider. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. With this move, Planned Parenthood loses about $60 million worth of taxpayer funds. Now, that still only represents about 15% of the organization's annual federal funding, but this does represent a big win for pro-lifers. Refusing to comply with guidelines from the Trump White House, Planned Parenthood is walking away from about $60 million in funding from the government's Title X program. By law, the money can't be used to pay for abortions.
Abortion is central to their business model.
Pro-life advocates say for too long, Title X benefited the nation's largest abortion provider.
For years, Planned Parenthood has used Title X dollars as a slush fund. They've used it for advertising, they've used it to pay the electricity bill.
The Trump administration now requires family planning clinics funded under Title X to stop abortion referrals, provide services in a location that does not perform abortion, and financially separate federal money from abortion services. Upon Planned Parenthood's exit from the Title X program, the organization's acting president said, "We will not be bullied into withholding abortion information from our patients," calling the new rule an attack on reproductive health care. Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the House has passed legislation to block this rule. The Senate must now do the same. The Title X program was created to help subsidize preventative health services, including contraception, for low-income families. Now, pro-life, faith-based organizations can tap into the available funds.
Now that Planned Parenthood has opted out of the Title X program, that's $60 million that other facilities, other clinics can have access to provide family planning services.
Several states and the American Medical Association are suing the Trump administration over these pro-life changes to the Title X program. A federal appeals court in San Francisco is weighing this lawsuit. Wyatt, oral arguments are scheduled to begin next month.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. President Donald Trump welcomed the Romanian president to the White House today. The two leaders are exploring ways to cooperate on defense and energy issues. The Trump administration views Romania as a particularly important ally, with aides saying the president wants to show the importance of Central Europe to the United States as a security and business partner. The president will be traveling to Poland later this month. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has reauthorized an existing ban on travel to North Korea for American citizens. There are concerns over arrest and long-term detention in the country. Anyone who wants to visit or travel through North Korea must apply for a passport with a special validation from the State Department. Two U.S. representatives blocked from visiting Israel and the Palestinian territories are speaking out. Yesterday, Democratic Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib criticized President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after they were denied entry.
The decision to ban me and my colleagues, the first two Muslim American women elected to Congress, is nothing less than an attempt by an ally of the United States to suppress our ability to do our jobs as elected officials.
Omar and Tlaib have repeatedly criticized Israeli policies, calling for boycotts against the country. Tlaib was later granted permission to visit her relatives in the Palestinian territories, but she decided not to go, rejecting the conditions placed on her entry by the Israeli government. Hong Kong's leader pledges to open up dialogue with city residents, but offers no concessions. The move follows months of anti-government protests. Chief Executive Carrie Lam says Hong Kong's local government is, quote, very willing to communicate genuinely with people attending peaceful rallies. Demonstrators held a massive but peaceful rally Sunday after earlier protests had been marked by violence. Joining me now by Skype from Hong Kong is Wilson Leung, member of the Progressive Lawyers Group, a pro-democracy organization which advocates for human rights. Wilson, welcome in. Some protest organizers are skeptical about meeting with Carrie Lam. Do you think she's sincere in calling for dialogue, and do you think she's really ready to make the serious changes the protesters are calling for?
I think it's more a stalling tactic on her part, because the protesters' demands have been quite clear. And incredibly consistent over the past 2.5 months. As you might have known, there's 5 demands. One is withdrawal of the extradition bill. One is resignation of Carrie Lam, independent inquiry, and retraction of the riot designation for the protests. So they're incredibly consistent in their demands, and these haven't changed at all. And so as a leader, what she should do is actually respond to the requests, either some of them or all of them, and indicate where she's going with that, rather than saying, oh, we need to hear what the people want. Because what the people want, for a movement of 2 million people, has been incredibly consistent.
Your group has been one of many that condemned the excessive use of police force against the protesters, as you mentioned earlier. Carrie Lam proposed a fact-finding study to take a look at police response specifically. Do you think a fact-finding study would be effective?
Not really, because she's proposing to use a mechanism, which is a body called the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Now, there's many problems with that body, and that's why people have been calling for a judge-led independent inquiry. One of the problems with that body is that they have no power to summon witnesses. So they're severely hampered in the evidence that they can collect. Another problem with that body is that its proceedings are not open to the public, unlike a judge-led inquiry. So the public would have little idea what was going on. And a third difficulty with that body is that the members are appointed by the government. And the problem we've been seeing in recent years is they've been stacked with pro-Beijing politicians on the pro-Beijing side. And so from the public's point of view, there's very little credibility and assurance that that body can provide the independent inquiry which the public is asking for.
Many of your members are voluntarily providing legal representation to arrested protesters. What are you hearing from those who have been behind bars?
I think there's been some concerning reports, indeed, of police mistreatment. There's been concerns about, the physical conditions in which they're held, the sort of physical, abuses, slapping around, pushing, verbal abuses, and that sort of thing from some police officers. And there's also concerns about, in some cases, of police stalling for time in the time that the arrestees get to see their lawyers. So there's certainly been concerns about that.
Well, we've been hearing about so many problems like these in Hong Kong, but it's nice to get more details about all of these issues and to hear about the work that you guys are doing and other lawyers to try to help at least. Wilson Leung, member of the Progressive Lawyers Group, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Italy's prime minister resigned today in the face of a no-confidence vote, but was asked to stay on in a caretaker role as the country's president starts talks tomorrow with parties on forming a new government.
Parlamentare dal Presidente della Repubblica per comunicargli ufficialmente.
Giuseppe Conte made the announcement at the end of an hour-long speech to the country's Senate. The man he blames for the turmoil is Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, seen on the left of the screen. He accused Salvini of putting the nation's interest at risk by promoting his own personal and party interest first. After 19 days of being trapped on a rescue ship, 15 migrants decided to jump into the sea in a desperate bid to reach Italy. They were picked up by the Italian Coast Guard. Crew members described the situation on the boat as, quote, out of control and desperate. 83 migrants remain on board. The most senior Catholic cleric found guilty of sexually abusing children will learn the outcome of his appeal tomorrow, but it may not be the final word on his convictions. An Australian appeals court heard arguments from Cardinal Pell's lawyers and prosecutors in June. In an unusual move, the court will be live streaming its judgment. Cardinal Pell could walk free if all 3 judges acquit him of 5 convictions. It's also possible the judges could call for a retrial. Authorities in Paris, France are cleaning up the streets around Notre Dame Cathedral after the fire that damaged the landmark church in April. Cleanup crews swept, sprayed, and vacuumed the streets on Monday to scrub away any lead left over from the blaze that decimated the roof and toppled the spire. Toxic dust spewed into the air as hundreds of tons of lead melted in the fire. The cathedral and surrounding areas have been closed to the public since April 15th and are likely to stay that way for years. Joining us now is Celine Toddy, European correspondent for the National Catholic Register. Celine is also a Paris native. Celine, can you give us an update on the cleanup? How is it going?
Well, around 40 workers are gradually returning to the cathedral for the first crucial phase of consolidation of the structure, which is meant to enable safe access to the structure, especially the vaults. The restoration process was suspended by Paris administration because of the risks of lead contamination. Indeed, during the blaze of April 15, hundreds of tons of lead melted and spread toxic dust into the air. So it raised a lot of concern among the population. But now that the restoration works have resumed, it is a very good news for the people in charge of the restoration process, as they repeat every day that the structure is at risk, the structure is still very fragile, and the cathedral is not saved yet.
French President Emmanuel Macron has said he wants Notre Dame rebuilt within 5 years, but reconstruction experts doubt that's possible. What are you hearing?
Well, experts are quite divided on this matter. The architect-in-chief of the cathedral, Philippe Villeneuve, thinks it is possible, but many others are concerned about the consequences that such a haste can have on the cathedral. It is, for instance, the case of Pascal Jacob, the president of the new association Restaurons Notre Dame. I interviewed him recently, and he told me that the second phase of the restoration work, which is the diagnosis, should last until summer 2020. And then the effective restoration work can start and will last around 24 months. So in his opinion, it is pretty unlikely that it can happen.
And of course, as a result of all of this, the cathedral is closed to the public, but there are masses being held inside. How's the community reacting?
Yes, there was one mass in June 15, but it was a private mass celebrated by the Archbishop of Paris, Monseigneur Michel Aupetit, but it's still closed to public until further notice. So all the masses that were usually celebrated inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame are now celebrated at the very emblematic church of Saint Sulpice. This was the case for the Assumption Day, because we have this very traditional annual procession for Assumption Day. It started from the bridge of St. Louis, very close to the cathedral, and then the procession proceeded along the streets of Paris with a statue of the Virgin Mary, rescued from the flames during during Notre Dame blaze. So it was a very high symbol of hope for the pilgrim and the faithful. And then the Mass for Assumption was celebrated inside the church of Saint Sulpice and presided over by Monseigneur Michel Aupetit, Archbishop of Paris.
Very interesting. Well, it's so insightful to get a look at what is going on in and around the cathedral, and of course we'll continue to follow that as efforts are ongoing to rebuild it. Celine Toddy, European correspondent for the National Catholic Register. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, one group's mission to promote human rights for the Uyghur ethnic group in China, and a new poll in the race for the White House as the Democratic frontrunner rolls out his first TV ad in Iowa. Tonight, we take a closer look at conditions for China's Uyghur Muslims. The Chinese government in Beijing continues its efforts to force the ethnic minority group to give up their culture and their faith. More than 1 million Uyghurs are believed to be held within China's so-called re-education camps in the country's Xinjiang region. Joining me now is Nury Turkel, chairman of the Uyghur Human Rights Project based in Washington. Nury, welcome.
Thank you very much.
China's government doesn't like to speak openly about these re-education camps. Tell me, what are conditions really like in those camps?
Based on the survivors' account, they spend pretty much all day denouncing their religion, self-critiquing, watching propaganda videos, and studying Xi Jinping thoughts. Xi Jinping is the chairman of the Communist Party in China. And also condemn the foreign-based Uyghur organizations as a stabilizing force, extremist or separatist. So this indoctrination program has been rightly labeled and categorized, described as the human engineering, if you will. The Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghurs, as Secretary Pompeo put it recently, is a stain on a century.
It's pretty scary the way you describe it. Why do you think the Chinese government is targeting Uyghurs specifically in this way for persecution?
The Chinese government's claim is that they're doing this for fighting against extremism. But when you look at the way that they have paved the way, constructed modern-day concentration camps with the specific purposes of breaking family roots, connections, and origin, it is very telling that it has a very racist, like a genocidal intent. When you listen to the government officials' statements, including the Chinese ambassador to the United States, that they're doing this to turn the Uyghurs into normal human beings, as if the Uyghurs are subhumans, and their way of life, their practice, supposed to be forcibly changed, and they should be subject to this modern-day ethnic cleansing.
Wow. And last month, Chinese officials claimed most of the people detained in these, what they call re-education centers, have been released and integrated back into society. What do you make of that assertion?
The latest Chinese government's claim is directly a result of international condemnation and media scrutiny. They have been on hot water since August 2018 with the United Nations committee challenged the Chinese government to disclose information. They initially even did not acknowledge the existence of these camps, but now they come out early this year calling it boarding schools. And recently, the regional government chairman, some people think that he misspoke, but he said 90% of the people being released. That is not true. We're talking about 4 times the size of Washington, D.C. population. We're talking about, based on Pentagon's estimate, up to 3 million people. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific recently called it concentration camp and said that there are about 3 million people currently being held. So the Chinese government, after investing that much money, this has become a political economy, and using Uyghurs' life and their homeland as a laboratory for a surveillance state, and letting the companies like Huawei, Hikvision to make tons of money, will not close the camps overnight. What they were trying to do is to change the narrative and engaging in misinformation campaign. At the same time, they're converting, apparently, some of those camps into illegal labor camps.
Wow, it's just incredible when you think about the numbers like you're talking about, the millions of people. And obviously it's scary stuff, but it's so important that we continue to highlight this problem as it continues to go on every day. Nury Turkel, chairman of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, thanks so much for coming in here and talk to us about it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Former Vice President Joe Biden is airing the first TV ad of his 2020 presidential campaign in Iowa today.
We have to beat Donald Trump.
The 60-second ad highlights the former vice president's work alongside former President Barack Obama while emphasizing his campaign's goal of beating President Trump. Biden now has a double-digit lead over his nearest Democratic rival. In a new CNN poll, 29% of potential Democratic voters favor Biden. That's up 7 points since the last poll in June. Senator Bernie Sanders is second with 15%, followed by Senator Elizabeth Warren. Up next, a Catholic aid agency is speaking out against a possible change in foreign aid funding. We'll discuss the potential impact. Catholic Relief Services, the official international humanitarian agency of the Catholic community in the United States, is adding its voice to those urging the Trump administration not to rescind foreign assistance funds. That aid is intended to support U.S. diplomatic and development efforts. In a letter to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the chairman of the Catholic Relief Services Board of Directors and the chairman of the Bishops' Committee on International Justice and Peace warned, quote, "The crises today are dire. U.S. moral and financial leadership is necessary." Joining me now is Bill O'Keefe, Executive Vice President for Mission and Mobilization at Catholic Relief Services. Bill, welcome back into the newscast. How much money are we talking about potentially losing for humanitarian efforts?
Up to $4 billion is what we're hearing could be rescinded by the administration.
Which is a large amount.
Huge amount of money that reflects hundreds of thousands of people who would not get help with nutrition, help with education, farmers not getting education that they need in order to produce more food and feed their families.
And we don't necessarily think about all that. We just think about it in numbers, and we don't think how that sort of impacts the people. I mean, if that were taken away, many of these people simply couldn't function in the same way.
Yeah, it's not about the money. It's about the number of people who would suffer as a result. The families who are counting on assistance in order to develop themselves and live their God-given potential.
So why do you guys say that this aid money in particular is of use or is of importance to U.S. interests? Because we know it benefits the people in other countries.
So the president today said that cutting some of this assistance would be penny wise, and I assume he meant pound foolish as well. And that's what we think, because if we don't invest in peacekeeping and development assistance, then we have to spend more on defense spending later on. Because if we prevent conflicts, we don't have to participate in them. If we don't invest in ending the root causes of migration, then we have more people suffering the journey up from Central America and all the problems that come with that. So it's just in our interest to invest now to address these problems where they are, so that people don't suffer and so that our national security is also advanced.
The Office of Management and Budget requested the temporary hold on the funding a little over a week ago, asking for an accounting of all funding that has not yet been officially designated for specific purposes. But you say that doesn't necessarily mean the money wouldn't be put to good use.
Exactly. The government has money allocated from Congress, and they take the year to then decide how to spend it. And so in the last 6 weeks, it's actually, after planning for most of the year, that's actually when they spend a lot of it, because they spent most of the year getting their act together and planning. This year in particular, the appropriations was delayed and there was a government shutdown. So there was more pressure to spend towards the end of the year. By OMB saying you can't spend this money at the end of the year, it basically means they are going against the will of Congress, which with bipartisan support said, we want to help these people around the world.
Tell me, because you had mentioned before specifically about the people in South America, Central America. Obviously, we hear about all these people coming up to the United States. Just tell us again, just overview what you guys do to really try to help these people there in their home countries so they don't have to leave.
Doing a couple things. First, we're addressing gang violence by working with youth who are at risk of falling into gangs and helping them to go back to school and to find a job. It's a very successful program, over 14,000 young men and women participating. We're doing a lot of work in the drought-prone areas of Guatemala, and there's a huge 6-year drought going on there now, to help those farmers to be able to stay and make a living where they are so they don't have to make the very difficult decision to take this very dangerous journey.
We're very happy to highlight the work that you guys do with Catholic Relief Services, because it is so important. So we thank you for coming on. Bill O'Keefe, Executive Vice President for Mission and Mobilization at Catholic Relief Services, to talk about us with us.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Finally tonight, a Catholic group in search of the oldest grandparents in Ireland. On September 8th, thousands of grandparents from all over the country will travel to Knock Shrine. The event draws more than 10,000 attendees each year. The Catholic Grandparents Association has issued an invitation for the oldest grandparents and longest married couple to attend the annual pilgrimage. To learn more about the trip, or just how to submit entries into the Grandparent Search, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. And we wish them the best in finding the oldest grandparents in Ireland. Hopefully it will serve as a good reminder of the importance of marriage and family. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.